welcome to my dad's podcast, My Black is Transnational. Follow him on Instagram. Hope you enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome to another episode of My Black is Transnational. My name is Dr. Ibe-Lamberts and I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to this podcast. If this is your first time listening to this podcast, please feel free to download or subscribe to this podcast on any of your favorite podcast listening apps, whether it's Apple, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, whatever your preferences may be. This podcast is available on that platform. So, you can also find me on Instagram at BlackTransnational17. You can also find me on Twitter at MBITransnational. If you want to email me, please feel free to do so at blacktransnational17@gmail.com. All right. So before I continue, I just also want to mention to my listeners that this will be the final episode of season 1 of My Black is Transnational. Yes, I have decided that we are going to break this down into seasons, and I just felt that makes a lot of sense. I think summertimes, I need to commit my summertime to working on my research to continue to deliver more quality content for you all. A lot of my colleagues who are doing research right now are probably somewhere across the world collecting data and doing different things. And most importantly, it's just good for my sanity. I want to be able to spend time with my family and just relax and take a step back or two and continue to work on this, right? Work on myself, but also work on this podcast and its evolution. And I think having it broken down into seasons is going to be a worthwhile approach, and I think it'll really make the podcast digestible for you all, the listeners. So if you've been listening since the first episode, I thank you for just sticking with me, and if you are listening to it for the first time, please feel free to download and subscribe, and you can listen to all the other episodes from the past and just binge listen at your free time. And I think you'll enjoy it, and I really would appreciate your feedback. So as I mentioned, ratings and your reviews are very important for me, not just for the sake of growing this podcast, but for the sake of taking that information, using it properly, and making this podcast better for you. So I appreciate your ratings and your feedback. So thank you for those who have shared those in the past and continue to share your thoughts. Okay, so today's episode and the season finale, we'll be talking about a word that I think is ever present in the transnational African community, specifically the Nigerian community. But I think in most of Western Africa, this word has been used to describe African Americans, and I think it's a word that's very important to discuss. It's very provocative, but I think it is critical to have this conversation because I think it'll be very beneficial as far as bridging that gap between, Black immigrants and specifically African immigrants and African Americans. The reason being is that we think about what a word is and how it can evolve and how it can construct not just identities but perceptions, and how perceptions also influence attitudes. So this word, I think personally, was a very important word when it comes to my upbringing and how I was able to distinguish my culture from others, and how I was able to shape myself and how I was able to guide myself moving forward. And whether that's a good thing or bad thing, we'll find out in the future. But I would like to talk about that and what moving forward we as Black people can do in order to possibly cease and desist the use of this word, or at least find a way to be able to continue to have conversations about what this is and this divide that it has caused, and how we can be able to move forward to continue to unify and become a stronger transnational Black community. Okay, so first and foremost, the word is Akátá, A lot of times people hear that say Akata or Akata or Akata. No, it is Akata. It is a Yoruba word from the Yoruba people who are originally from the western side of Nigeria. Okay, and this word has now grown into something that is used not just only by Yoruba people anymore, but pretty much all Nigerians and people in some parts of West Africa. Some Ghanaians also use this word as well. So the term Akata now has grown, and its application is now used as a way to identify those who may not necessarily be African, right? So primarily that group would be the African Americans. Um, the word originally, by definition, simply means wildcat, right? But I think sometimes when we think about the words and we think about it in English, we understand for those who have taken different language classes or who speak a different language, we know that translating things to English is not a smooth process. So it's not something that you can just say, "Oh, for every apple there's this word in Yoruba. For every, banana there's this word." And like the concept that we're using to express something doesn't necessarily fit into that same box but in English. If hopefully you all get my drift. What I'm essentially saying is that the way it's translated wasn't necessarily its intention, but I think the intention has changed over time, in which now, yes, the intention might be a little bit more malicious. So when I say this, I say that because the original intention behind it was to say, okay, it's something that is not necessarily domesticated. So when we think about a feral cat, right? A cat that may not be domesticated, that doesn't necessarily have a home, right? And doesn't necessarily, because it's not domesticated, it may not necessarily be brought up properly and cultured. Now, all these things, for those who are African Americans, it does not sound good. I'm not trying to sugarcoat anything, but I'm giving you the definition of how the word in itself was supposed to mean that, okay, this is someone that is not necessarily homegrown in a sense, right? And African Americans by through history weren't brought up in Africa, right? We all know how that went: involuntary slavery, um, forced migrancy, all those things. And but by definition, they didn't grow up in their native homeland. So because of that, that terminology was supposed to intendedly meant to say that these people were not the ones who grew up in Africa. But as I mentioned already, the way the words have been intended and used now has been more to ostracize. It's essentially a derogatory term, right? And the reason I explain its origin and its genesis is because I think there's a little bit of confusion and misinformation. It's if you Google it, sometimes you see that Akata means like cotton picker, and no, that's not what it means. All right, it's not necessarily referring to the history, specific instances in the history of the African American. It's not a word directed to to define or illustrate a moment, or not a moment, but the history of African American. That's not what it's referring to, or that's not what it alludes to. The reality is that it's a word that meant wildcat, and I think now what has evolved to is pretty much saying that African Americans are not, they don't have the same culture as African immigrants. They're not brought up in Africa, therefore they're missing their roots, and they're not authentic, right? And it's not something that they're not growing up or being brought up in their place of origin. Therefore they're wild, right? Therefore they're feral. So anything that they do is because they're not domesticated in culture. So with that being said, that's the definition of the word, and its application and how it's used now is something that I completely don't agree with. And I think it's a lot of younger African people, immigrants or non-immigrants, uh, are becoming more aware of derogatory words and how it can affect people and how it creates divide. And growing up, I think about this word now, and I think about, wow, like how powerful it was for me, and maybe for those who are listening who can relate, how it created such an identity crisis or even an identity divide for black people and for people like, because when I grew up, my mother would always say, don't be like these Akata people, right? And I never really understood what that meant initially, but ultimately, it's important to understand how parents, African parents, will use that terminology as a form of reference for things that are perceived as misguided, as inappropriate, as uncultured, right? As things that you should not set as your standard. That is what Africans, immigrants, believe the African Americans are, right? They believe that because of whatever the case may be, whatever false perceptions they have about the history, they believe that this group of people, this population, is so misguided that they don't want their children to identify or relate to that behavior or that culture because it's not tied to the African ways, the African beliefs, is more Americanized, right? So that fear that a lot of parents or just a lot of older shit, I'm like, maybe some even today, some younger ones, if some of those beliefs still exist, is that you don't want to be an Akata, right? The most important thing that an African mom, even African dad, will say is, don't go and marry an Akata. And growing up, I used to like wonder, like, man, like, why is that? But subconsciously, those things would guide what the standards are, not necessarily for myself, but for the sake of just not hearing my parents complain, right? Not hearing my parents nag me or make all this noise about wanting to identify with something that they don't believe I am, right? So even if I'm growing up in America and I'm doing all these things, there's so much association with that, with certain culture and being an Akata. So that word is very, very powerful. And like I said, for all my, African Americans, and that's including my wife who listen to this, I'm not here to sugarcoat. I'm simply telling you what it is from my perspective and my perspective only. So there may be other people who may disagree, who don't feel the same. I'm not here to contest that because I don't have any guests on this show, as you notice. So what I'm saying ultimately is that this word is a problem, okay? I personally do not like this word. I don't like the fact that it's used to describe a group of people in which you have no idea what they went through. No idea the post-traumatic issues that have trickled down to this day. You don't understand what how to even what they've been through, how they've constructed and built a culture by themselves with no aid, no assistance of sorts, and have become a force, regardless of whatever people want to say. They have become united force of sorts, and they're making their way. And we, as African immigrants, we're not necessarily helping the cause if we are trying to find ways to make ourselves more authentic than the other. It's almost similar to a holier than thou type of thing, right? And that's something that's very persistent, especially you'll notice with along the older generation. And it's that whole, there's a fear behind it. I must admit that there's a fear behind not wanting to lose your culture. And this is where the transnational angle comes in, because the fear of not wanting to lose your culture drives you to sustain your culture. What drives you to sustain your culture is to find a point of reference of what not to be like. And not to get too, literate, not to get too professor like or get too deep into the research. There is some literature that does show that a lot of African immigrants perceive associating with African Americans as a form of negative assimilation. And by negative assimilation, it means that instead of you leveling up, right, instead of you coming into the US and stepping your game up by messing with those people, so to speak, you're falling off. right? You're taking a step back, right? It's kind of like when your parents say, well, you hanging around with them thugs, right? You ain't going far. You ain't going nowhere, right? And that's essentially the same mindset translated, and that was translated to me, which was, don't go and be an Akata, right? Like, don't go up there. Don't listen to hip hop. Like, even if I'm listening to rap, like if I'm listening to rap and this type of music, sometimes it's like, oh, you're listening to this Akata thing, so now you're going to be sagging your pants. Oh, you're going to be doing this, right? So I won't make my accent come out too strong, but all those things, when we think about the hip hop culture, when we think about black culture and what that means or how that's perceived by older generation or first generation African immigrants who may have strong views towards African Americans, hip hop culture really is considered, okay, you want to be an Akata, so that means that you're going the wrong way, right? And you're misleading yourself, right? And that adds to the divide, right? So that word itself, for me, shaped my mindset as to how to behave, right? How to do things in order to not get in trouble, how to, which people should be your friends, who should not be your friend, right? Or who do you want to not get too close with, right? So there was a certain, and that's, I'm speaking on more of a closed-minded aspect. For there's some people who are definitely open-minded, but in general, that word just made me realize that I'm not African American. It was a constant reminder that I needed to sustain my roots, sustain my culture. I needed to be able to always, never forget where I came from. So, in a sense, as ostracizing as this word is, it's very crazy how strong it is as a vice for transnational behavior because of that fear of not wanting to lose your culture, the fear of African parents telling you not to marry an Akata person or to not, you know, associate yourself with that. That's how people keep it within the culture. That's how Africans continue to communicate with Africans and sometimes hesitate to build relationships with African Americans. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, an African American sometimes may not even understand that, right? May not understand it. They just consider it another slur, another word that is used to oppress intraracially from your own people, from people who look like you. You're being called something behind your back, right? You're being called something by, you're being whispered about by from African parents to their kids or their friends about who you are and a word that represents your people, which is supposed to be a group of people that are lost, are uncultured, misguided, pretty much feral, right? And I can only empathize and imagine just the annoyance and the anger and the frustration, to find out what that is, right? I don't even, I wish my wife was here to have this conversation with me, but I can only remember the first time we talked about what anakata is, and she was like, wow, like for real? Like almost like she was getting ready to fight with me, like, that's how you feel? And I have to kind of be like, nah, that's not me, but that's the word. And what I don't want is to be able to walk around with you around among other Africans and you don't know what that means. Like, I want you to know what's up, right? So we can defend, ourselves accordingly. But that's a word that a lot of us have to have a conversation about, because yes, there are some issues that a lot of African immigrants come in to the United States and not feel embraced by African Americans, right? There's that issue that lies there as well. The issue that a lot of African immigrants will tell you that the people who made fun of me the most were not white people, they were not brown people, they were African Americans, the black folks, right? They were the ones that, called me African booty scratcher, the ones that told me that I stink because I smell like a goosey from the house that my mom was cooking heavily in, whatever the case may be. But I wasn't embraced by those people. So you find yourself not associating yourself with that, right? And there's so many other underlying things to that, but I don't want to get too long-winded. But what I want to do is explain that this word needs to go. Um, this word needs to disappear because I think in this day and age, in 2019, we can't afford to deal with any more intraracial differences. I mean, stress and stressors are, I'm not a psychologist or anything of that notion, but I do understand determinants of health, and I understand that stressors um are psychosocial, right? And that means that they are caused by things in your social environment. And when you have people who look like you, who are living in the same spaces as you, whose kids now go to the same school as your kids or your sisters or brothers, you are all residing and thriving or trying to struggle in the same spaces, but yet we are calling each other names. And in this case, it seems to be very one-sided because it's not. I mean, African Americans don't have their own terminology per se, or one word within the language that means anything derogatory. But in this case, as African immigrants, we have to stop using that word in order to differentiate ourselves between African Americans and us, right? We have to start bridging gaps. And the way we can bridge gaps is by having a conversation. We understand that you want to sustain your culture. We understand that you don't necessarily want to go to America and take a step backwards. That's not the intentions of your immigration. And you want to keep that culture, but I don't think it needs to be at the expense of another group. You don't have to point at an African American and say, "Oh no, don't be that." Instead, do the opposite in order to understand what success is. I think using that mindset to try to help elevate or create that perception of success or what it's like to lead a good life. I think you're just as bad as white people. You're just as bad as those bigots. You're just as bad as those people who colonize your communities, right? And still call you nigger, no matter what color you think, no matter where you think you're from. At the end of the day, they're calling us niggas too behind our back. Maybe not highly done in America, but all over the world, right? That N word that I've said out because I don't care at this point. It matters. We say it out there. It's important. That word is prevalent all over the world, right? Not just, and it's not the hip hop NIGGA, but the NIGGER, right? The one that has historical differences. And in the future, we'll talk a little bit more about who really should be saying that word, and when it comes to the Africans versus African Americans, because African immigrants may not be entitled to that word as well, and a lot of us use it. But that's another story for another day. For the sake of this particular podcast, the terminology needs to be erased because we are at a stage in our lives right now where we do not need to bring each other down to lift ourselves up. We have to be able to have a conversation. As mentioned before, we need to reconcile within ourselves and understand that our fears of losing our culture should not be blamed or used at the expense of other people. Instead, we should be educating ourselves. We should be teaching each other about our respective cultures. We should be helping those who you feel are lost or wild, bring them into the culture. There's so many people who want to know about the African or the diasporan culture. Educate them, elevate them, raise your words, right? Don't just use words to bring people down, but raise your words to elevate each other. We have to, in order for us, and I will continue to repeat it, in order for us to become an institution that is formidable, we have to be able to bridge that gap and unify as an entire black population. Now, I do understand that we have to have our distinguishable factors in order to help each other in the long run. We have different cultures and it varies, and we have different practices and beliefs, but these beliefs should not be intended maliciously to bring each other down. Assimilation to the United States is not based upon you identifying with African Americans because you're scared of being racism coming to you, because of you feeling like you might be targeted. You're still gonna get targeted. You're black. And if you're in the wrong space at the wrong time, you might be at risk. Your accent can only do you so much. So I I I know that I can get deeper into this conversation, but I'm not going to get deeper. I'm going to use this as a form of an introduction that I will segue into next season, because I think we can have a really rich conversation, and I want to have more people that are involved um, for this, because I think we can have a healthy discussion that we can set as a form of almost sort of like a template, a model discussion panel of sorts that we can use for future conversations with among people like us. Because I think once we're able to really have these open conversations, and maybe I've missed it, maybe this shit has happened already, all right, and maybe I didn't get the memo, but if it has, then I need to see it more. I need to see it happen again, all right, because if not, we're on an escalator that's going down, and we're trying to walk down when it's going the opposite direction. We'll walk up when it's going the opposite direction. I'm sorry, I'm directionally challenged. but I think that in order for us to really make a change, it has to come interracially. We have to look at ourselves. We have to reflect. When we talk about systematic racism and things that are systematic or systemic, the operative word is system, right? And what I think happens when a system upgrades is that it has to look within itself. It has to check out for bugs and fixes errors internally. And for us as black people to become that system, we have to always look within ourselves and understand our fears, understand our hopes, understand what our abilities are, what our capacity is, and we need to start using our strengths to sharpen each other. Stop using this fear of the loss of culture to separate your kids from engaging with their African American friend by educating them and introducing them to a culture that they never knew. Like, don't deter them from that. If you are an older, parent now, don't deter your kids from that type of life. I'm fortunate enough to be married to an African American, and I think it was the best decision I ever made. I've been able to be exposed to a world that I knew about, but I've been able to bring my wife into a world that she may never have gotten the opportunity to know about if she never met me. And she'll tell you that. So I know that some people may be uncomfortable having the discussion, and if it makes you uncomfortable or you makes you uncomfortable listening to this, then I'm talking to you. I mean, I really am, because that means that you don't understand that you're not better than anyone else. Not because of your skin color, you're not. Not because of your accent, you're not. Not because your name is Kelechi. See, I said it like an American, it's Kelechi. But at the end of the day, all this needs to stop. As black people, we cannot continue to suffer from self inflicted wounds all the time. Akata cannot be the new N word. It cannot persist as another way, another chain, another negativity, which I've always been told that negativity is the shackles of the black people, right? We cannot continue to shackle down ourselves with such a word. And I hold all my second generation, first generation, 1.5, all my transnational responsible for doing better. I understand that you want to continue to take pride in your ways, but you don't have to do it at the expense of anyone but yourself. So the word needs to go. Akata needs to be dealt with. It needs to be a word that goes away. So I'll stop there as far as my discussion on this topic. I know that I went on and on. But I hope that you all got something from that, and I hope that it provoked a a discussion of sorts, or something maybe that you want to have with me or with people that you may know in your family, or have a conversation with about that. I hope that I've been able to start that kind of conversation and keep the ball rolling. But I want to use this opportunity as I kind of get closer to the end. I want to use this opportunity to just kind of wrap up season one with some words. Uh, First and foremost, I want to thank you, the listener, for just being there, for taking an opportunity to click on this podcast and listen to it. And if you liked it, continue to listen to it to anticipate the next episodes, and just continue to digest all the things that I've sent or shared with you all. This process was by far one of the boldest things that I've done. I mean, I've done some bold things, but this was a very, very ambitious move by me, and I did not know what the outcome of will would be. But I mean, I've been thinking about this for years, and I thank the people who were on my team, my wife included, and my friends, who really encouraged me to continue to pursue this, and just say, go do it. Just go do it. See what happens. What's the worst that can happen? I know people would mention, yeah, you're a good talker, you're a good speaker, you're a good lecturer, and you people need to hear you. And I was like, I don't care about that. Like, I know, I mean, I don't really, not that I don't believe in my strengths. It's just that that's not what I want to do. I want to be able to give my audience things that are long lasting, things that can be applied, things that can provoke conversations that can go on, and ultimately produce results, solutions, strategies, approaches. I don't want to just talk for the sake of talking. I can do that. I'm good at that, but I don't want to do that. I want my words to have substance. I want my words to have drive. I want my words to have fuel. And I think taking this risk, I'm not even a calculated risk of sorts, but I taking this chance to start this podcast was one of the best things that I could ever do. So I just want to thank you, the listeners, for listening, and continuing to take this in. I thank God for the opportunity. I thank my wife, who has been a frequent guest, who is damn near my co-host on this, and my producer, who listens to all my episodes before I put them out there, who gives me feedback whether I like it or not, whether I like what I said, and she doesn't like what I said, or may question some of the things that I may have mentioned, and I may want to argue with her and say, no, you just don't get it, and just her being completely honest with me all the time. I am blessed, and I know I say it all the time, but I am blessed to have a partner like her in my life that is willing to do whatever it takes for me to be happy, without necessarily sacrificing her integrity. That's love. That's a love that you cannot just synthetically make. That's original. So I thank you for being my support system, Dr. Wanda. And I know if you listen to this, you already know that all these things remain true. I want to thank my mentors. I want to thank my brother, who was in Nigeria, Toby, for being my number one fan in a sense. I miss you, man, and I hope to have you on the show at some point. But he calls me from Nigeria, and talks to me about it, and he keeps me motivated. He asks me questions. He shares the topic with his friends and other family members. I love you, bro, and that energy that you bring to me every time we talk, it's something that I take with me. So, thank you so much for that, and just what I intend to do moving forward with this as I continue to grow, continue to become better, continue to become smarter, continue to hopefully become more provocative in a good sense. I want to thank all my guests as well. I don't want to get too selfish. I want to thank all my guests, Dr. Bryce Henson, Dr. Latifa, Kabiru, who just became Dr. Latifa Kabiru recently. So congrats to you on that, Doc. Shout out to Dr. Amavi Bailey. Shout out to, my, God, she's gonna kill me. Mrs. Darlene Amu, right, from Namaste Yoga, or the yoga studio in Ghana. I always call her Namaste Yoga, but, thank you to Mr. Jeff Badu. Thank you to Dr. Dore Lungashiswaka. I'm coming up. I don't have a script right here, but I'm thinking about all the guests. To my daughter for being on the show as well. For TT Low Key, coming on the show and talking about African music and what that means. And so thank you to all my guests, and I'm looking forward to having many more guests. Some of them may be, repeating guests, and we'll have new guests in the future as well. But you all have made this season a fantastic experience for me, and hopefully for you all, the listeners. I am grateful, and I guarantee you that I know that some of this shit, I'm being real, some of this shit was a struggle. I know from my first episode and what that sounded like to what this sounds like, and I know that I haven't hit my peak. I'm not even close. We're not even close to where we're about to be. We are just we're just thinking about scratching the surface. All this right now is still an idea, right? And we're just making it happen. But I guarantee you, next season, trust me, trust your boy. Next season, we're not taking no prisoners. We're coming strong. We're coming ready. I'm gonna be able to let you know what it's like to really be transnational. Not just by words, by action, but through research. We're gonna build this bridge. We're gonna bridge that gap. Alright, so thank you all again. I'm very fortunate. My name is Dr. Kelechi Ibe-Lamberts. I hope to talk to you again soon to remind you that my Black is transnational. And I hope that throughout this season, that yours will be too. Have a good one. Until next season.